The first thing you register is not the darkness, but the air. It is thick, heavy, and carries a complex scent. There is the sweet, waxy smell of a single candle. Its flame will only star in the gloom. Beneath that, the smell of damp stone and old wool from the tapestries that smother the walls, swallowing both sound and light. There is also the cloying perfume of dried herbs, lavender and chamomile strewn amongst the rushes on the floor. A futile attempt to mask the underlying odors of unwashed bodies, stale food, and the ever-present chamber pot. You are 13 years old. The year is 1456. You are in a chamber deep within Pembroke Castle, and you have not seen the sun or breathed fresh air in weeks. Every keyhole is plugged with wax. Every window is covered with heavy shutters and drapes. You are not a prisoner, not in the way a traitor in the tower is a prisoner. You are a high-born lady, and this suffocating confinement is a privilege. It is the ritual of lying in, the prescribed period of sequestration before the birth of an heir. But you are still a child, and your body has been promised to a dynasty. Now, that dynasty has come to collect. This state of confinement was not a punishment, but a medically and spiritually mandated procedure for the aristocracy. The belief was that the expectant mother and her unborn child were intensely vulnerable, not just to chills and sickness carried on the wind, but to malevolent spirits and the corrupting influence of the outside world. The birthing chamber was intended to be a sterile, sacred space, a sort of secondary womb. Before we unseal these forgotten records, consider this a moment to register your presence. A like serves as your signature, and a subscription grants you access to all future findings. Provided you believe these stories must be unearthed. In the comments below, share who you believe is the most misunderstood figure in history. Therefore, let us silence all other distractions. It is time to consult the chronicles and let the dead speak for themselves. The individual at the center of this impending ordeal was Lady Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond and Derby. In late 1456, she was formally enclosed within the prepared chambers at Pembroke Castle in Wales, under the care of her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor. Her husband, the 26-year-old Edmund Tudor, had died of plague just weeks earlier, on November 3rd. Margaret was thus a widow at 13, pregnant with the sole heir to her husband's Lancastrian claims. The political stakes could not have been higher, as the dynastic conflict later, known as the Wars of the Roses, was already simmering. The child in her womb was not merely a baby, it was a strategic asset, a potential king. The room itself was a meticulously constructed environment designed according to the medical principles of the day. Humoral theory, the dominant medical doctrine, dictated that health depended on the balance of bodily fluids, or humus blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Pregnancy was seen as a state of humoral imbalance, making the woman susceptible to influences that could disrupt her system, a draft of cold air, a sudden fright, or even a glimpse of an ugly person could supposedly have catastrophic effects. To counteract this, the lying-in chamber was sealed to a degree that is difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective. The tapestries covering the walls served multiple purposes. They provided insulation from the cold stone, they absorbed sound to create a tranquil environment, and they depicted scenes intended to edify the mother-to-be. These were oft unbiblical narratives, or tales of heroic chivalry, meant to encourage fortitude and piety. The floor was covered with thick layers of rushes, which were periodically replaced, but the overall hygiene of such an arrangement was poor. The single candle or heavily filtered liberate, bright light was thought to be agitating and potentially harmful to both mother and infant. The result was a perpetual twilight, a warm, stagnant, and silent world where the only measure of time was the changing of the guard outside the door or the delivery of meals. This environment was her entire reality as she awaited the onset of labor, a biological process for which her own body, by virtue of its physical immaturity, was dangerously unprepared. The very air she breathed was a carefully curated blend of incense, herbs, and human respiration, a thick atmosphere of anticipation and dread. The reason for this ritualized suffocation, this prescribed isolation, was not rooted in maternal care but in dynastic calculation. Margaret Beaufort was not simply a young noblewoman, she was a vessel of immense political value, and the child she carried was the culmination of a century of royal ambition in contested claims. To understand the pressure exerted upon her 13-year-old body, one must first understand the blood that ran through her veins. Margaret was a direct descendant of King Edward II through his third surviving son John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. Specifically, she was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt and his longtime mistress, Catherine S. Winford. The children of Gaunt and Des Winford, the Beaufortess, were born out of wedlock. They were later legitimized by an act of parliament and a papal bull after their parents' eventual marriage. However, a crucial and intentionally ambiguous clause, the accepte dignitate regale, the royal dignity accepted, was later inserted into the legitim, is in a document by their half-brother, King Henry IV. This clause intended to bar the Beaufort line from ever inheriting the throne. In a time of civil strife and contested succession, such legal technicalities were often considered negotiable. The Beaufortess remained immensely wealthy, powerful, and, most importantly, possessed a tangible, if flawed, claim to the English crown. Margaret, as the sole surviving heir of the senior Beaufort line, was one of the greatest heiresses in the kingdom. This inheritance made her a pawn in the burgeoning conflict between the two rival branches of the Tudor Dynasty, the House of Lancaster, represented by the frail and mentally unstable King Henry VI, and the House of York, led by the ambitious Richard, Duke of York. In the 1452s, with Henry V's reign proving ineffective and his own heir only recently born, the Lancastrian faction was desperate to consolidate power and secure its future. This meant controlling assets, and Margaret Beaufort was a primary asset. As a minor in the ward of the crown, her marriage was a prize to be awarded by the king. Initially, her wardship was granted to William de la Pole, the Duke of Suffolk, who briefly married her to his son, John de la Pole. This marriage, likely unconsummated and of dubious legality, was dissolved after Suffolk's fall from power and execution in 1450. The prize of Margaret's wardship was then re-awarded by King Henry VI to his own maternal half-brothers, Edmund and Jasper Tudor. This was a masterstroke of Lancastrian strategy. The Tudors were staunch loyalists to the Lancastrian cause, and by marrying Margaret to the elder brother, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, her immense wealth and her potent royal claim were firmly bound to the king's inner circle. The marriage took place on November 1, 1455. Margaret was 12 years old. Edmund Tudor was 25. While the canonical age for marital consent for a girl was 12, it was commonly understood by physicians and moralists of the period that physical maturity sufficient for childbearing did not arrive until at least 14 or 15. Early consummation was known to be dangerous. However, the political urgency of the situation overrode all such concerns. An heir was needed immediately to solidify the new alliance and create a new nexus of Lancastrian power. Conception followed almost immediately. This fact is crucial. There was no period of waiting for Margaret to mature. The dynastic imperative demanded the risk be taken. By early 1456, the 12-year-old girl was pregnant. The burden placed upon her was twofold. She had to survive the pregnancy, and she had to produce a healthy male child. Failure in either regard would be a catastrophic blow to the political ambitions of her husband, her in-laws, and the entire Lancastrian faction. When Edmund Tudor was captured by Yorkshire forces and died of the plague in captivity in November 1456, the weight on his child bride became absolute. She was now the sole guardian of the future of the House of Tudor and a significant hope for the House of Lancaster. Every herbal potion she drank, every prayer she uttered within that sealed, suffocating chamber was dictated by this overwhelming political reality. Her body was not her own, it was an instrument of the state. The medical system that dictated Margaret's confinement was not born of ignorance, but of a vastly different and internally consistent understanding of the human body. To the 15th century mind, the world operated on a system of sympathies and correspondences, where the microcosm of the human body reflected the macrocosm of the universe. Sickness was not primarily an invasion of foreign organisms, for such things were not yet conceived of. It was a state of profound imbalance. a disharmony within the individual's own constitution, often influenced by external forces like the environment, the stars, or the will of God. The central pillar of this entire intellectual edifice was humoral theory, a doctrine inherited from the classical Greek physicians Hippocrates and Galen, and which had dominated Western medical thought for over a millennium. This theory posited that every human body contained four fundamental fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with one of the four classical elements: air, water, fire, earth, one of the four seasons, and a combination of two of the four qualities: hot, cold, moist, dry. Blood was hot and moist, like air in spring. Phlegm was cold and moist, like water and dry, like fire in summer, like earth in autumn. A healthy individual, it was believed, maintained a perfect balance of these four humors, a state known as Asia. Illness, or Asia, was the result of one or more humors becoming excessive or deficient. Pregnancy was viewed through this lens as a naturally hot and moist condition, an abundance of the blood humor, which was necessary for the growth of the fetus. The physician's or midwife's role was therefore not to cure but to manage. They sought to help the woman's body maintain its delicate humoral equilibrium against external shocks. A sudden chill could introduce an excess of cold and dry qualities, clashing violently with the pregnant state and potentially harming the fetus. This is the logic that demanded a warm, sealed room. Compounding this was the complete absence of germ theory. The concept that invisible living microbes could cause disease was centuries away. Instead, the primary vector for sickness was believed to be miasma, or bad air. This was the foul-smelling vapor thought to arise from decaying organic matter, swamps, and other unsanitary places. It was believed that inhaling this corrupt air could directly disrupt the body's humors and generate disease. Consequently, medical practice was obsessed with controlling the patient's olfactory environment. The sealing of the lying-in chamber was a defense against miasma from the outside world. The burning of incense and the strewing of aromatic herbs were not mere pleasantries. They were active medical interventions designed to purify the air within the chamber and create a protective, fragrant barrier. This framework explains the lack of what we now consider basic hygiene. Without an understanding of bacteria, there was no reason to sterilize instruments or wash hands between patients. In fact, a substance like pus, which we recognize as a sign of infection, was often considered laudable pus by Galenic physicians, a positive indication that the body was successfully expelling its excess or corrupted humors. The hands that would eventually touch Margaret Beaufort in her most vulnerable moments would be carriers of countless microorganisms. Yet, in the medical understanding of the day, as long as they were not visibly soiled, they were considered clean. The danger was not in what was unseen, but in the palpable qualities of the environment: the temperature of the air, the humidity, and above all, the smell. This meant the very measures enacted for her safety according to the highest medical standards of her era were, in reality, cultivating the ideal conditions for the infections that posed the greatest threat to her survival. The principles of humoral and miasmatic theory were not abstract medical doctrines debated by physicians. They were translated into a meticulously executed protocol for preparing the physical space of birth. The transformation of a standard castle chamber into a lying-in room was a deliberate and resource-intensive process, a piece of domestic engineering intended to create a fortress of maternal safety. This preparation would have begun weeks in advance of her formal enclosure. The chosen room would have been one of the finest in Pembroke Castle, selected for its distance from the noise of the courtyards and kitchens, and preferably with a southern exposure to maximize warmth, even if the sunlight itself was to be blocked. The first step was a thorough cleansing, but not in the modern sense. Surfaces would be scrubbed, but the primary goal was the elimination of odors, the physical manifestation of miasma. Floors would be washed with vinegar or rosewater. Linens and hangings would be aired and scented. Following this, the process of sealing began. Heavy wooden shutters were closed and barred over the windows. Thick, opulent tapestries were then hung over the shutters and across every wall. These were not merely decorative. They served as a critical layer of insulation against drafts and as a sound barrier, cocooning the room from the outside world. Any remaining cracks in the woodwork, around the doorframe, or even the keyhole, would be painstakingly plugged with wax or cloth. Sunlight was methodically banished, and the only illumination would come from a few carefully placed tallow or beeswax candles, or the mauve glow of the managed fireplace. The central feature of this newly created environment was the bed. It would have been a large, canoped structure, itself a room within a room, draped with heavy curtains of velvet or brocade. The bedding was of the finest linen, layered with wool blankets and fur coverlets, all designed to maintain the essential humoral warmth. Near the bed, a small altar or prie-dieu would be placed, complete with a crucifix, a book of hours, and perhaps a relic of a saint associated with childbirth, such as Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of pregnant women. This was a medical space, but it was inseparable from the sacred. The air itself was medicated. A fire was kept burning low in the hearth, regardless of the season, to ensure warmth and to circulate the air, which was heavily perfumed. The rushes on the floor were mixed with fragrant herbs like lavender, meadowswort, and chamomile. Censers would burn, filling the air with the smoke of frankincense and other resins. This continuous fumigation was an active defense against corruption, an attempt to create a pocket of purified air for the mother to breathe. Every object brought into the room was carefully considered. The tapestries would depict edifying scenes, biblical stories of virtuous women, or tales from chivalric romance. Anything considered ugly, grotesque, or disturbing was removed, based on the theory of maternal impression, which held that a powerful emotional shock or the sight of a deformed object could physically imprint upon the developing fetus. The food and drink provided were also prescribed by humoral theory. Warm, moist foods like broths, cod, airless, warm, spiced wine or ale drinks, and roasted meats were favored, while cold or raw foods were forbidden. When the preparations were complete, the noblewoman's formal entry marked the beginning of the lying-in period. She would be led to the chamber by her female relatives and attendants. Once she crossed the threshold, the door was closed, and she entered a world governed entirely by women. From that moment till weeks after the birth, no man, with the potential exception of a priest or, in dire emergency, a physician, was permitted to enter. This ritual would have been profoundly isolating. The dimming of the light and the muffling of all familiar sounds would have signaled her complete separation from the known world. The chamber, designed as a sanctuary, became her entire reality. It was a warm, dark, silent, and sacred space, a meticulously crafted womb, which, unknown to its creators, was concentrating the very microbial dangers it was meant to exclude. Once the door to the lying-in chamber was sealed, a profound social transformation occurred. The rigid patriarchal hierarchy that governed every aspect of 15th century life was temporarily suspended. Within these tape-dried walls, a different authority held sway, one that was exclusively and unassailably female. This was the gossip's world, a term derived from gobturants but evolving to mean the intimate female companions who attended a birth. For the duration of the confinement, the chamber became a sovereign feminine territory, governed by a strict hierarchy of experience, age, and status, at the apex of which stood the midwife. The midwife was the central medical practitioner in this drama. She was not a physician. She held no university degree and likely could not read the Latin texts of Galen that formed the basis of academic medicine. Her authority was derived not from theory but from extensive, hard-won empirical knowledge. Midwives were typically older women, often widows, who had borne children themselves and had apprenticed for years under a more experienced practitioner. Her knowledge was a complex blend of practical obstetric skill, herbal pharmacology, and ritual tradition, passed down orally from one generation to the next. She commanded immense respect within the female community, and her presence was a source of both comfort and fear, for she was the arbiter of life and death. Upon entering the chamber, the midwife would assume command of the patient's immediate care. She would assess Margaret's condition through touch, observing the position of the fetus externally and palpating the abdomen. Her hands, unwashed by modern standards, were her primary diagnostic tools. She would prescribe specific foods and drinks to maintain Margaret's humoral balance, direct the preparation of herbal infusions to ease anxiety or strengthen contractions, and lead the other women in prayers and incantations intended to protect against demonic influence and ensure a safe delivery. She was part physician, part priestess, a figure of immense practical and spiritual power within the confines of that room, subordinate to the midwife, but socially superior were the high-ranking female relatives. For Margaret, the key figure would have been her own mother, Margaret Beauchamp, Duchess of Somerset. The role of these aristocratic women was multifaceted. They were there to provide emotional support and encouragement, drawing on their own experiences of childbirth. They were also the guardians of tradition and status, ensuring that every aspect of the lying-in was conducted with the ceremony befitting their rank. They managed the household staff assigned to the chamber and acted as the primary witnesses to the birth, a crucial function in an era where the legitimacy of an heir could be challenged. Their presence underscored the dynastic importance of the event, a constant, giving reminder to the young girl at the center of the ordeal of what was at stake. Beneath these figures was a team of specialized female attendants. A wet nurse would have been selected months in advance, a healthy young woman who had recently given birth herself. Her own diet and humoral state were carefully managed, as it was believed her qualities would be passed to the infant through her milk. There were laundresses tasked with the endless cycle of soiled linens, servants to prepare the prescribed foods and airless, and women whose sole job was to tend the fire and the candles. Their cradles stood ready, often attended by a woman designated as a rocker. This entire assembly of women, from the Duchess down to the humblest servant, formed a closed, self-sufficient community. Their collective focus was singular: the successful delivery of a male errand, the survival of priority. For Margaret, this room full of experienced women would have been a source of immense psychological pressure. She was the object of all their care, all their anxiety, and all their expectations, yet she held the least power and possessed the least knowledge of the violent biological process her body was about to undergo. The assembled women were her protectors, but their collective presence also transformed her personal ordeal into a very public, dynastic performance. The final days of waiting were a unique form of psychological torment, a period of stasis defined by an acute awareness of an impending, violent motion. For Margaret Beaufort, time itself seemed to congeal within the warm, stagnant air of the lying-in chamber. The world, once all landscape of castles, courts, and political maneuverings, had contracted to the dimensions of this single, sealed room. Days were indistinguishable from nights, their passage marked only by the trimming of a candle's wick, the arrival of a meal, or the soft intonations of the priest chanting the litany of the saints outside her door. This sensory deprivation, intended to calm the humors, had the contrary effect of turning her own mind and body into the sole focus of her existence. Every internal sensation became magnified. The fluttering kick of the fetus, once a sign of life and hope, was now a reminder of the physical ordeal to come. The dull ache in her lower back, the pressure on her bladder, the cumbersome weight of her own small frame, these were the preliminary notes of a symphony of pain she had been taught was both inevitable and divinely ordained. The cultural framework of her era provided two primary lenses through which to view her situation: piety and duty. Neither offered much in the way of genuine comfort. Piety dictated that the suffering was a direct inheritance from Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden. The pangs of childbirth were a woman's penance, a physical manifestation of original sin. To endure it with grace and fortitude was an act of religious devotion. Margaret would have spent hours in prayer, her fingers tracing the illuminated figures in her Book of Hours. Her attendants would read her the lives of female saints, particularly her own namesake, Margaret of Antioch. The legend of this saint, who was swallowed by a dragon and then burst forth from its belly unharmed, was a potent and popular metaphor for surviving the devouring trial of childbirth. This narrative offered a model of miraculous deliverance, but it also reinforced the monstrous, life-threatening nature of the event itself. Duty was an even heavier burden. The constant, quiet presence of the other women was a testament to this. Their hushed conversations, their meticulous preparations of linens and birthing aids, their very gazes were imbued with a dynastic urgency that transcended personal concern for the child bride at its center. They were attending to a precious vessel, and their primary anxiety was for the cargo. Margaret would have understood this calculus implicitly. She had been raised in a world where marriages were alliances and children were assets. She knew her function, her personal fear, her youth, her grief for her recently deceased husband. All these were subordinate to the singular, overwhelming requirement that she produce a living son for the Lancastrian cause. The knowledge of the danger was ambient, unavoidable. Death in childbirth was a statistical commonplace. Every woman in that room would have known someone, a sister, a cousin, a neighbor who had perished in the lying-in chamber. They would have spoken in euphemisms of childbed fever or of labors that were too long or unnatural. These whispered histories formed a backdrop of grim reality against which the prayers and rituals were performed. Margaret, though young, would not have been shielded from this. She knew that the bed she currently rested in could easily become her deathbed. This was not a morbid fantasy, but a rational assessment of the odds. This combination of religious fatalism, dynastic pressure, and the known high probability of death or permanent injury created a unique psychological state. It was not one of passive waiting, but of intense, controlled dread. She was a child being prepared for a battle she could not refuse, armed only with prayers and the assurances of older women whose own survival was a matter of fortune rather than skill. Her body, which should have been in the final stages of its own growth, was now a host to another life, a biological paradox that was straining it to its absolute limit. In the final silent hours, as the attendants watched for the first definitive sign, the world for Margaret Beaufort was reduced to the rhythm of her own breathing and the frantic, hopeful beating of her own child's heart. Then, the first true pain would have arrived, sharp, deep, and unmistakable. The waiting was over. The first spasm was a deep internal clenching, entirely different in character from the diffuse aches and pressures of the preceding weeks. It was a fulcrum that radiated from the base of the spine, a physiological signal that could not be mistaken. With this initial contraction, the state of passive vigilance in the lying-in chamber instantly ceased. The air, which had been thick with quiet anticipation, now crackled with a new and purposeful energy. The process had begun. The midwife, who had been resting on a small stool near the fire, would have risen with a practiced calm. Her movements were deliberate, meant to project an aura of control and competence. Her first action would be to approach Margaret's bed, her expression unreadable but her presence authoritative. She would speak in low, reassuring tones, asking Margaret to describe the sensation while her experienced eyes took in every detail of the young girl's posture and breathing. Her initial assessment was crucial, determining whether this was a true labor or a series of false pains, a common occurrence. But the rhythm of the contractions, once established, would provide the definitive answer. As the second and then the third spasm followed, each one slightly stronger than the last, the midwife's diagnosis was confirmed. She would announce to the other women that the time had come. This declaration triggered a cascade of prescribed activity. One attendant would move to the small altar to light a blessed beeswax candle, its flame a physical representation of the prayers being offered for a safe delivery. Their roles shifting from passive companionship to active spiritual and emotional support. They would begin a soft recitation of the Ave Maria, or psalms deemed appropriate for the occasion. The midwife's next step was the mobilization of more tangible aids. A key object in aristocratic births was the birthing girdle. This was typically a long scroll of parchment or vellum, inscribed with prayers, magical sigils, and the names of God, which was physically tied around the laboring woman's abdomen. The belief was that the sacred words, pressed against the body, provided a direct line of divine protection, easing the passage of the child and warding off demonic interference that might seek to obstruct the birth. The application of this girdle was a solemn moment, a fusion of medicine and sacrament. Simultaneously, another attendant would be dispatched to the chamber's dedicated hearth to prepare a specific medicinal drink. This was not merely for hydration or comfort. It was a carefully formulated prescription based on humoral theory. A common preparation was a strengthening cordial, a warm, thick drink made from ale or wine, thickened with eggs and breadcrumbs, and heavily spiced. The ingredients were chosen for their specific properties. Cinnamon was considered hot and dry, believed to stimulate the womb. Saffron was thought to bring on contractions and lift the spirits. Sugar and fine spices were signs of wealth, but also considered powerful sources of energy. This was administered to Margaret not to dull the pain, but to fortify her body for the immense physical exertion to come, ensuring her internal humors remained balanced and full of the necessary heat and moisture. The midwife would then encourage Margaret to leave her bed. The prevailing wisdom was that remaining upright and mobile during the early stages of labor was beneficial. Walking, supported by two attendants, was thought to use the force of gravity to help the baby descend. This period of ambulation, within the tight confines of the tape-dried room, was a slow, rhythmic procession time to the waxing and waning of the contractions. With each wave of pain, Margaret would be encouraged to lean against a high-backed chair or the bedpost, breathing through the spasm as the midwife murmured instructions. The pain itself was not seen as an enemy to be defeated, but as a necessary, productive force. The midwife's role was to help Margaret work with it, to endure it, and to channel its power towards the ultimate goal. The initial phase of labor was thus established a controlled, ritualized, and highly managed process where every action, from a whispered prayer to a spiced drink, was part of a unified strategy to navigate a perilous and sacred biological event. The hours that followed the initial onset of labor were a study in physiological rhythm and ritualized response. For Margaret, the somatic experience was one of a relentless, returning tide. Each uterine wave began as a deep, distant pressure, swelling into a crest of excruciating, all-consuming pain that held her body in a rigid grip, before slowly receding, granting a brief, precious interval of near normalcy. As time distorted itself within the candle-lit gloom, these intervals of peace grew progressively shorter, while the peaks of agony grew longer and more intense. The objective of the assembled women was not to stop this tide that would be to halt the birth itself, but to provide Margaret with the physical and spiritual fortitude to withstand it without succumbing to exhaustion or despair. The primary tool in this effort was prayer. The management of the soul were considered inextricably linked. The midwife and the senior women would lead a continuous, low-voiced recitation of prayers, creating an auditory landscape of devotion that was intended to be as medically effective as any herbal remedy. The Litany of Saints, with its repetitive call and response structure, was particularly favored. The names of saints associated with protection, especially female saints who had endured bodily torment, would be invoked: Saint Agnes, Saint Catherine, and above all, Saint Margaret of Antioch. The belief was that each invocation was a direct appeal for intercession, creating a spiritual bulwark around the birthing bed. This was not a passive comfort. In the 15th century mindset, it was an active form of spiritual warfare, a defense against the demonic forces that were believed to be drawn to the vulnerability of a woman in labor, seeking to corrupt a child or destroy the mother. The pain itself was framed as a holy trial, and Margaret's groans and cries were interpreted not as signs of suffering to be silenced, but as a form of prayer in themselves, a penitential echo of Eve's original curse. Alongside this spiritual armamentum was the application of the midwife's herbal knowledge. This was the pharmacology of the era, a system based on the perceived qualities of plants and their ability to influence the body's humors. Throughout the early stages of labor, Margaret would have been administered a series of carefully prepared decoctions. An infusion of raspberry leaves, a remedy with a long history in folk medicine, was believed to strengthen and tone the womb, making the contractions more productive. Chamomile or verbena might be steeped in hot water to create a tea intended to soothe the nerves and calm the agitated spirits, counteracting the emotional turmoil that could, in humoral theory, disrupt the physical process. These remedies were gentle. The midwife's goal in this phase was to support the body's natural process, not to force it. Other interventions were aromatic. Cloth soaked in rosewater or vinegar might be placed on Margaret's forehead. The aesthetic quality of the vinegar was thought to be cooling, providing a counterpoint to the excessive heat generated by the labor. Smelling certain strong herbs, like mugwort, was also thought to have a restorative effect. The midwife's pharmacopoeia was a sensory one, engaging taste, touch, and smell in a holistic attempt to maintain the patient's humoral equilibrium. However, as the hours wore on and the labor deepened, the efficacy of these gentle ministrations began to wane. The contractions, which had been several minutes apart, now came with punishing regularity, leaving Margaret breathless and trembling in their wake. The herbal teas could do little to touch the profound, visceral pain that was now the central feature of her existence. Her body, underdeveloped and slight, was being subjected to a level of physical stress it was ill-equipped to handle. The women would have observed the signs of her flagging endurance, the sheen of sweat on her brow, the pallor of her skin, the way her voice grew hoarse from crying out. The early phase of labor, with its manageable rhythms and its focus on spiritual undouble support, was drawing to a close. The midwife's calm demeanor would remain unchanged, but her internal calculations were shifting. The body was signaling that it was entering a new, more dangerous stage of the conflict. The gentle encouragement was no longer sufficient. More direct, and more invasive, methods would soon be required. As the laboring body's rhythms became more violent and less forgiving, the midwife's role transitioned from that of a supportive guide to a clinical diagnostication. The prayers, the herbal infusions, and the rhythmic walking had served their purpose in the initial phase, but they were tools of endurance, not of intervention. Now, a critical question had to be answered. Was this immense suffering productive? Was the child descending? Was the path clear? The midwife had to move beyond external observation and undertake a direct, manual investigation of the body's interior landscape. This procedure, the internal examination, was the core of her obstetric practice, a moment of profound physical intimacy and diagnostic gravity. Her preparation for this act would seem, to a modern observer, shockingly inadequate. She would not have scrubbed her hands and forearms with soap. The concept of microbial contamination was entirely absent from her medical framework. Cleanliness was a visual and aromatic quality. If the hands appeared clean and were free of foul odor, they were deemed fit for purpose. Her primary preparation would be to lubricate her hand and fingers to ease their passage and reduce friction. The lubricant itself was a product of the domestic environment and unguent of rendered animal fat, typically lard or goose grease, or perhaps a costly olive oil in a wealthy household like Margaret's. This was stored in a small pot and applied liberally, its sole purpose being mechanical, not hygienic. Margaret would have been positioned on the bed, likely on her back with her knees drawn up, supported by her other attendants. The midwife, her face set in a mask of professional concentration, would approach the bed. During the brief respite between contractions, she would insert one or two lubricated fingers into the birth canal. Her touch, though intended to be gentle, was exploratory and firm. She was reading the body's topography by feel, a skill honed over countless births. Her primary objective was to locate the cervix, the mouth of the womb. She would assess its texture, whether it was still firm like the tip of a nose, or had softened to the consistency of lips, a sign of readiness. She would then measure its dilation, using her fingers as a primitive caliper to gauge the width of the opening. If the labor was advanced, or if she needed more information, the examination would become more invasive. The midwife would wait for the peak of a contraction to pass and then insert her entire hand into the vagina. This act of profound physical intrusion, performed without analgesia on a terrified 13-year-old, was a standard medical procedure. Its purpose was to gain a complete understanding of the situation. The midwife could confirm the extent of the dilation and the thinning of the cervical wall. More critically, she could identify the presenting part of the fetus. She would feel for the hard, round shape of the skull, confirming a normal head-first presentation. She would try to locate the suture lines of the fetal skull to determine the exact position of the head, whether it was facing forward or backward, and if it was properly flexed with its chin to its chest. For Margaret, the experience would have been one of acute, localized pain superimposed upon the broader agony of labor. The pressure of the midwife's hand within the already traumatized and distended tissues, the probing of her fingers against the sensitive, dilating cervix, would have been an almost unbearable violation. Cries of pain would have been met with firm but calm exhortations to be brave, to endure this for the sake of the child. The pain was not considered iatrogenic, it was simply another necessary component of the overall suffering of childbirth. After a few moments of this tactile investigation, the midwife would withdraw her hand. The unguent, now mixed with blood and amniotic fluid, would be wiped on a cloth. She would then deliver her verdict to the anxious women assembled around the bed. In Margaret's case, the findings were likely alarming. Her physically immature pelvis was a constricted passage. The midwife's exploration would have revealed a situation, that was progressing with dangerous slowness. Despite hours of powerful contractions, remained stubbornly narrow. The descent of the fetal head was minimal. The baby was, in effect, trapped. With this diagnosis, the atmosphere in the room would have shifted irrevocably. The possibility of a natural, unaided birth was now fading. The midwife's expression, previously one of calm authority, would now be tinged with a deep, professional concern. Nature's course was failing. The time for human intervention was drawing near. The midwife's grim internal diagnosis precipitated a silent, but profound shift in medical strategy. The phase of supporting a natural process was over. The phase of mechanical intervention had to be contemplated. This required a consideration of the physical tools at her disposal, the contents of the leather roll or wooden box that constituted her portable arsenal. These were not instruments of precision or finesse, forged by local blacksmiths. They were rudimentary, functional, and designed for the application of brute force in desperate situations. The midwife's own toolkit was primarily for manipulation and, if necessary, extraction. A common instrument was the blunt hook. This was a simple, curved piece of iron on a wooden handle, designed to be carefully inserted into the birth canal to find purchase on a fetal part, such as in the armpit or groin, to help rotate a badly positioned infant or apply gentle traction. A more aggressive variant was the crochet, or sharp hook. This tool was similar in form but terminated in a sharpened point. Its purpose was far more direct. In cases where the fetus had already died within the womb, a common outcome of prolonged, obstructed labor, the crochet was used to pierce a part of the body, often the skull or the trunk, to anchor the hook and allow the corpse to be forcibly pulled out. Its use on a living fetus was a catastrophic last resort, as it would inevitably cause fatal injury. Another tool was the fillet, a simple loop of cloth or leather. The intention was to maneuver this loop over the infant's head or a limb, allowing to assistants to pull on the ends, applying a steady, strong traction. While less overtly violent than the iron hooks, the force that could be exerted was immense and could easily result in dislocations, broken bones, or fatal compression of the neck or skull. These were the primary implements of the midwife: tools to pull, to turn, and if necessary, to dismember. However, the midwife operated under a strict set of limitations, both professional and ecclesiastical. The most destructive procedures, those that required the deliberate disarticulation of a fetus within the womb, were often the province of a different and far rarer practitioner, the male surgeon or physician. The summoning of a man into the sacred, female space of the lying-in chamber was the ultimate signal of failure and despair. It meant the midwife had exhausted her skills and that the life of the mother was now in such peril that the most extreme measures were required. The infant at this point was often presumed to be dead or was considered a secondary concern to its mother's survival. The surgeon's toolkit contained instruments that were even more formidable. The primary challenge in a case like Margaret's, an obstructed labor due to a constricted pelvis, or halo-pelvic disproportion, was the unyielding size of the fetal head. The surgeon's objective was to reduce the volume of the skull. For this he used a perforator. This instrument could take several forms, but it was essentially a long, sharp, dagger-like tool, sometimes with a guarded point that could be exposed once in position. It was inserted into the birth canal, guided by the surgeon's fingers, until it rested against the fetal skull. With a sharp thrust, it would be driven through the bone, puncturing the cranium. The contents could then be evacuated, causing the skull to collapse inward. Once the skull was perforated, the surgeon would employ a large, strong hook, a more robust version of the midwife's crochet, to secure a grip on the now malleable head and extract it. If this was not sufficient, a more complex and brutal procedure known as embryotomy would follow. Using a combination of hooks and guarded knives, the surgeon would systematically dismember the fetus within the womb. The arms and legs would be severed at the joints and removed, followed by the decapitation and removal of the head, and finally extraction of the torso. This was a blind, tactile operation, performed deep within the mother's body, with an extraordinarily high risk of causing fatal tears to the uterus, cervix, and bladder. It was a salvage operation of the most horrific kind, a desperate choice in a zero-sum calculation where only one life could be saved. For the women in Margaret Beaufort's chamber, The knowledge of these instruments and procedures was an unspoken horror. The midwife, feeling the unyielding bone of fetal head pressed against the unyielding bone of the mother's pelvis, would have understood the terrible path that lay ahead. Her own simple hooks were likely inadequate for the task. The next step, the one she was professionally under resist for as long as possible, was to concede defeat and send word for the man with the iron tools. The contemplation of surgical instruments was not merely a medical decision. It was one freighted with profound theological weight. In the 15th century worldview, the physical and spiritual realms were not separate. The agony that was racking Margaret Beaufort's body was more than a physiological event. It was an experience saturated with sacred meaning, a meaning that actively discouraged the very concept of relief. The primary obstacle to effective analgesia was not a lack of pharmacological agents soporificus like opium, mandrake, and henbane were known, but a deeply entrenched theological doctrine that sanctified female suffering in childbirth. This doctrine was rooted in the foundational narrative of the Christian faith, the Book of Genesis. The verse Genesis 3:16 was known to every literate person and taught to the illiterate through sermons and art. After Eve's disobedience, God's pronouncement upon her was unambiguous and eternal: in sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. In the pre-Reformation mind, this was not a poetic description of hardship, it was a divine legal sentence, passed down through every subsequent generation of women. The pain of childbirth was a direct, inescapable, and righteous punishment for the original sin that had damned mankind. It was a holy penance, a physical debt paid by every mother for the actions of the first. This belief system fundamentally altered the perception of pain. Where a modern medical practitioner sees pain as a negative symptom to be eliminated, the 15th century midwife and physician saw it as a necessary, even purposeful part of the process. It was a spiritual trial, a crucible in which a woman's soul was tested and purified. To endure this suffering with pious fortitude was an act of virtue, a way of participating in the great cosmic drama of sin and redemption. The cries of a laboring woman were seen as a prayer, her agony a form of atonement. To attempt to circumvent or erase this God-given pain would be an act of profound hubris, an attempt to defy a divine judgment. It would be cheating God of his due and robbing the woman of her chance for spiritual merit. This framework explains the stark difference between the acceptable and unacceptable forms of relief. The herbal remedies provided by the midwife, the raspberry leaf teas, the chamomile infusions, were considered permissible because their action was understood to be supportive. They were thought to help the body's natural processes to strengthen the womb or soothe the agitated humors. They did not block the pain, they merely helped the woman endure her holy task. Potent narcotics that could induce deep sleep or unconsciousness were viewed with extreme suspicion. Such substances created a state that was seen as a little death, a dangerous limbo where the soul was no longer in full command of the body. In this insensible state, it was believed a person was terrifyingly vulnerable to demonic influence or possession. Furthermore, the concept of a good death, the ars moriendi, was paramount. A conscious, prayerful end was the ideal. The hours of labor, teetering on the edge of mortality, were a woman's final and most important opportunity to prepare her soul for judgment. It was a time for confession, for contrition, and for receiving the last rites. To be rendered unconscious through this critical spiritual passage was to risk an unprepared death, jeopardizing eternal salvation for the sake of temporary physical comfort. For this reason, the priest was as essential a figure in the birthing chamber as the midwife. As a labor became dangerous, his role in administering the sacrament took precedence over any attempt to manage the mother's physical agony. For Margaret Beaufort, this theology formed an invisible prison around her, one even more confining than the taped-dried walls. The immense physical force of her body, attempting an impossible task, was matched by an equally immense ideological force that forbade any meaningful escape from the resulting pain. Every spasm that tore through her was not just a medical crisis but a spiritual imperative. She was expected to bear it, to offer it up, to find grace within the agony. To wish for it to stop was not merely a natural human response to suffering. It was a potential act of spiritual rebellion. Her ordeal was thus a public performance of piety, her endurance a measure of her worthiness in the eyes of both God and the dynastic witnesses who surrounded her bed. The tools of iron were a terrifying prospect, but the theology of suffering ensured that even before their use, there would be no reprieve. While the theological framework provided a spiritual context for the ordeal, it offered no quarter to the body's finite physiological resources. The relentless, unmedicated pain was not just an experience of the soul, it was a profound biological stressor, and the human body, particularly one as young and physically immature as Margaret Beaufort, has a finite capacity for such stress. As the hours of unproductive labor stretched from one candle mark to the next, her body began to enter a state of systemic failure, a cascade of physiological collapse driven by pure exhaustion. The uterus, the powerful engine of labor, is a muscle. Like any muscle subjected to continuous extreme exertion without rest or adequate fuel, it begins to fail. In modern obstetric terms, this is uterine inertia. The powerful, rhythmic contractions that characterized the earlier stages of labor would have started to degrade. They would become less frequent, their duration shorter, their intensity weaker. This was a sign of critical muscle fatigue. The midwife would have noticed this change with growing alarm, palpating an abdomen that was now softer, the contractions less defined and less effective. The body's primary mechanism for expelling the fetus was sputtering out. From the perspective of humoral theory, this would be interpreted as a dangerous loss of the body's innate vital heat, a fading of the life force required for the act of creation. This muscular failure was part of a wider metabolic crisis. A laboring body consumes a colossal amount of energy, comparable to running a marathon. Margaret, sustained only by sips of spiced ale and broth, was in a state of severe caloric deficit. The constant physical tension, the sweating, and the rapid breathing induced by pain led to significant fluid loss. Dehydration would have set in, marked by a dry mouth, sunken eyes, and a rapid, thread-wide pulse. As her body exhausted its readily available glucose stores, it would have shifted into a state of ketosis, beginning to burn fat for fuel. This metabolic shift produces ketones, which would have given her breath a distinct, sickly sweet odor. A low-grade fever would likely develop, not from infection, but from dehydration and the sheer metabolic stress of the ordeal. Her body was, in essence, shutting down. For a girl of 13, the mechanical consequences were particularly acute. Her pelvis was not that of a mature woman. The bones had not fully ossified and expanded to their adult dimensions. The fetal head, which in a normal birth acts as a dilating wedge, was in her case an unyielding object trapped within an unyielding frame. For hour after hour, every failing contraction, however weak, continued to grind the fetal skull against the soft tissues of her pelvic cavity. This unrelenting pressure on the structures trapped between the two bones, the bladder and urethra at the front, the rectum at the back, would have begun to cut off their blood supply. This condition, known as ischemia, is the first step towards tissue death. The cells, starved of oxygen and nutrients, would begin to die, a process called necrosis. While the devastating consequences of this damage would only become apparent days later, the injury itself was occurring right then, a silent, invisible trauma inflicted by the prolonged, static pressure. The fetus, too, was a victim of this exhaustion. The weakening uterine contractions were not only failing to advance the birth, they were also failing to advance oxygenated blood. Each contraction, even a weak one, temporarily compresses the blood vessels supplying the infant. In a normal labor, the baby has sufficient reserve to tolerate this. In a prolonged, dysfunctional labor, this repetitive, low-level asphyxia becomes critical. The fetus would have entered a state of distress, its heart rate slowing dangerously with each contraction. The midwife would have had no way of monitoring this directly, but she might have noted a change in the amniotic fluid. A severely distressed fetus often expels meconium, its first stool, staining the normally clear fluid a dark green or black. The sight of this upon the rupture of the membranes was a universally recognized sign of impending fetal death. By this point, Margaret Beaufort was no longer a participant in a natural process. She was the epicenter of a catastrophic physiological event. Her body was depleted, dehydrated, and feverish. The muscles of her womb had all but ceased their effective work. Her internal tissues were being crushed, and the child within her was likely dying, The body's capacity for endurance had been reached and exceeded. The result was a static, unresolvable mechanical crisis. The state of physiological exhaustion described a failing system, but it did not fully capture the new, terrifying reality that had settled into the lying-in chamber. The crisis had now evolved beyond one of depletion into one of absolute mechanical obstruction. The child was no longer in the process of being born, it was impacted. This term, in its darkest sense, meant that the fetus was irretrievably wedged within the maternal pelvis. It could not advance, and it could not retreat. Dynamic process of labor had ground to a halt, creating a static, lethal impasse. The midwife's repeated examinations would have confirmed this with chilling finality. Where before she had been measuring the slow, agonizing progress of dilation, now she would feel only a horrifying stosis. The cervix, though likely fully dilated, would be swollen and bruised from the hours of being ground between the fetal skull and the pelvic bone. The presenting part of the fetus, the crown of its head, had descended no further. It sat high in the pelvis, a fixed and unmovable mass. Her probing fingers would find no give, no capacity for rotation or further descent. The passage was blocked, not by an uncooperative womb, but by a fundamental incompatibility of dimensions. This physical reality would be mirrored by observable signs on Margaret's own body. As the upper, muscular part of the uterus continued its now feeble attempts to contract, the lower segment, the section that thins and stretches to allow for passage, would become dangerously overdistended. An experienced midwife might have recognized a telltale sign of this impending catastrophe, a visible or palpable ridge forming across the abdomen, just below the navel. This was the boundary between the thickening upper uterus and the paper-thin lower segment. It was a sign that the uterine wall was stretched to its absolute limit and was on the verge of tearing open a uterine rupture, an almost universally fatal event that would cause Margaret to hemorrhage to death internally within minutes. Another, more primal sign of the crisis would have begun to permeate the carefully perfumed air of the chamber. With the membranes likely long ruptured, the amniotic fluid, once a sterile, protective cushion, was now a stagnant pool. The warm, dark environment of the womb was an ideal medium for bacterial growth. The scent of putrefaction would have started to become noticeable, a foul, sweetish odor emanating from the birthing bed. In the humoral framework, this was a sign of internal corruption, a victory of morbid humors over the vital ones. To a modern observer, it is the unmistakable smell of sepsis and decaying tissue. The fetus, subjected to hours of oxygen deprivation and now sitting in an increasingly toxic environment, was almost certainly dead. The living child who represented the future of a dynasty had become a corpse, and that corpse was now poisoning his mother from within. This moment of diagnosis represented the ultimate turning point. All pretense of a natural birth, all hope for a living heir from this pregnancy, was now extinguished. The objective shifted with brutal clarity. The problem was no longer how to deliver a child, but how to remove a life-threatening obstruction from the mother's body. The fetus, an object of veneration and hope only hours before, was now reclassified in the most pragmatic medical terms. It was a foreign body, a destructive mass that had to be extracted by any means necessary to save the one remaining life. The prayers of the women around the bed would have changed in tenor, shifting from pleas for a safe delivery to desperate appeals for the mother's survival. The midwife, now confronted with a problem that had exceeded the limits of her art, had to make a declaration of her own failure. Her skills were in the manipulation of life, in the gentle persuasion of a natural process. The task at hand was now one of destruction and salvage. It required a different set of tools and a practitioner license, by custom and necessity, to perform acts of therapeutic violence. The collective gaze of the women would have turned to her, their expressions a mixture of fear and desperate inquiry. The midwife's response, spoken with the gravity of a death sentence, would have been to concede. Nature had been defeated. It was time to summon a man. The midwife's concession was not a simple admission of difficulty. It was a formal declaration of jurisdictional failure. The art of midwifery, a domain of female knowledge passed through generations, had reached its absolute limit. With this, the protocol of the lying-in chamber, which had so rigidly excluded the male presence, was deliberately and officially broken. A message, a whispered urgent plea, was dispatched from the sealed room, carried by a trusted female servant. It was a summons that signified the transition from a crisis of birth to an impending act of surgery. The weight that followed was of a different quality than the one that had preceded the labor. The former had been filled with a hopeful, prayerful anxiety. This was a heavy, near-silent vigil, thick with the certainty of mutilation and the proximity of death. The arrival of the physician or surgeon was a momentous and terrible event. The women, who had formed a tight, protective circle around Margaret's bed, would have parted, creating a path from the door. The man's entry was a physical and symbolic breach. He brought with him the cold errand, the alien sense of the outside world, a stark intrusion into the carefully curated, warm, and stagnant atmosphere of the chamber. He was an emissary from a different world of knowledge, one based not on empirical wisdom and feminine sympathy, but on the Latin texts of Galen and Avicenna, and on the brutal, practical craft of the barber surgeon. His presence instantly reconfigured the power dynamics of the room. The midwife, previously the unquestioned authority, now became his subordinate, an assistant to a procedure she was not permitted to perform. Margaret's mother, the Duchess, yielded her maternal authority to his clinical command. His first act would not be to rush to the patient. It would be to conduct a formal consultation with the midwife. Standing away from the bed, in the low, flickering candlelight, she would have recounted the grim narrative of the labor, its duration, now measured in days rather than hours, the mother's deteriorating condition, the cessation of any discernible progress. She would have described her own findings from her internal examinations, reporting the position of the fetus and the unyielding nature of the obstruction. The physician would listen intently, his expression impassive. This was a transference of the case, a formal handover of responsibility. He was not there to offer a second opinion. He was there to take command of a failed campaign. Following this briefing, he would turn his attention to the girl on the bed. For Margaret, this moment would have been the nadir of her terror. After weeks of seeing only the familiar faces of her female attendants, she was now confronted by a stranger, a man who was about to perform the most intimate and violent acts upon her body. His approach was not that of a comforter. His hands, though perhaps washed in a basin of water and vinegar as a perfunctory nod to cleanliness, were not the hands of a healer in the gentle sense. They were the hands of a technician. His own examination would be swift, efficient, and likely far less gentle than the midwife's. He was not exploring possibilities, he was confirming a diagnosis and assessing the physical terrain for the work that was to come. His lubricated hand would invade her body, the clinical touch a stark contrast to the supportive hands of the women who had held her. His internal palpation would be a grim confirmation of the facts, the impacted fetal head, the swollen and trapped soft tissues, the absence of any space or give. He would likely press on her abdomen, gauging the size and position of the uterus, noting the dangerous tension in its lower segment. He would listen for a fetal heartbeat with his ear to her belly and Hiromi's silence. Withdrawing his hand, he would deliver his verdict to the assembled women, likely speaking directly to Margaret's mother. His language would be direct, stripped of the pious euphemisms that had filled the room for days. The child, he would state, was lost. This was no longer a matter of debate. The sole objective now was to save the mother, whose own life was in imminent peril from exhaustion, putrefaction, and the risk of the womb tearing itself apart. The only recourse was the immediate extraction of the fetus in pieces. He would not ask for permission, he would state the necessity of the procedure. With the grim pronouncement made, he would turn to an assistant who had followed him into the room, a man who carried his leather roll of instruments. The final terrible phase was about to begin. The physician would give the order, and the roll would be untied, revealing the cold, polished gleam of iron and steel in the candlelight. With the instruments of iron and steel now exposed in the dim candlelight, the theoretical discussion of options ceased. The situation had moved beyond diagnosis into the realm of pure, pragmatic procedure. The decision facing the physician was not a choice between good and bad outcomes, but a brutal calculus of survival, a selection of the least certain path to a single, viable result, the preservation of the mother's life. The fetus, now clinically reclassified as a lethal obstruction, was a variable that had to be eliminated from the equation. This was not a philosophy born of cruelty, but one forged in the crucible of absolute necessity. and it was implicitly sanctioned by the theological and legal frameworks of the era. The prevailing doctrine, while fiercely protective of fetal life from the moment of quickening, recognized a dire scenario where both mother and child would perish without intervention. In such a case, the life of the mother, a baptized Christian with a soul in a state of grace, having presumably made a recent confession, took precedence over that of the unbaptized fetus. The unbaptized, it was believed, were consigned to limbo, a state of natural happiness but eternal separation from God. The baptized mother, however, had the chance of salvation in heaven. Therefore, the act of destroying the fetus to save the mother was not viewed as murder in the same sense as an elective abortion. It was a salvage operation, a tragic but necessary choice to save a sanctified soul, at the expense of one that was not yet fully integrated into the body of the church. This theological justification provided the moral clearance for the physician to proceed with what was, in effect, a controlled and systematic act of destruction. The first and most critical step in this procedure was to address the primary impediment, the unyielding diameter of the fetal skull. The operation, known as a craniotopy, was aimed at a simple mechanical goal, the reduction of this volume. Margaret would have been positioned on her back, her legs held apart and flexed by two or more of her female attendants. Their role had now irrevocably shifted from providing comfort to providing restraint. Any sudden movement on Margaret's part could cause the physician's hand to slip, resulting in a fatal perforation of her own tissues. Working entirely by feel, the physician would guide the perforator into the birth canal. This long, sharp instrument would be carefully maneuvered, his other hand placed on her abdomen to steady the uterus. His fingers, inside the canal, would serve as a guide, protecting the maternal tissues and directing the point of the instrument to the fontanella or a suture line on the fetal skull, the points of greatest weakness. Then, with a controlled and powerful thrust, he would puncture the cranium. A dull crack of bone would be audible in the silent room. Once the perforation was made, the instrument would be moved around to break up the internal structures, allowing the contents of the skull to drain out. The immediate result was the collapse of the cranial vault, transforming the rigid, spherical obstruction into a malleable mass of bone and tissue. With the primary obstacle reduced, the second phase, extraction, began. The physician would now introduce a sharp hook, the crochet. He would again work by feel, seeking a secure purchase point, perhaps in an eye socket, the mouth, or on a remaining solid piece of the skull. Once the hook was set, the grim work of traction would begin. This was a contest of pure physical force. The physician, bracing himself, would pull with a steady, relentless pressure, while the attendants struggled to hold Margaret's body in place. The objective was to draw the now collapsed head through the constricted pelvis. If the head was successfully delivered, but the shoulders then became impacted, a common secondary problem, the procedure would escalate to a full embryotomy. This was the systematic disarticulation of the fetus within the womb. A guarded knife, a type of Bistauer Y, would be introduced. The physician would attempt to sever the neck to deliver the head first, or if that was impossible, he would work on the limbs. He would hook a finger into an armpit to pull an arm down, then use the knife to sever it at the shoulder. This piece would be removed, and the process repeated. It was a blind, tactile, and horrifically dangerous process. A piece-by-piece disassembly performed in a confined, bleeding space. Every cut carried the risk of slicing into the uterine wall. Every sharp edge of a fetal bone fragment threatened to lacerate the mother internally. The immediate and certain violence inflicted upon the dead fetus was weighed against the high probability of the mother's death from continued obstruction. It was the only path to survival, and it was carved with a blade in the dark. The final stage of the procedure was a contest not of skill, but of relentless grinding force. With a secure purchase established by the crochet, the physician began the work of extraction. This was a slow, agonizing process, a matter of millimeters gained controlled traction. The attendants, their faces grim in the flickering candlelight, held Margaret's body down on the blood-soaked linens, their weight and strength pitted against her involuntary, pain-driven thrashing. The only sounds in the chamber were the physician's strained breathing, the low moans of the women praying, and the horrifying, wet, frictional sound of the body's passage being forced. The collapsed fetal head, now a jagged collection of bone plates, was the first part to be drawn through the narrow pelvic outlet. Each sharp edge of fractured bone scraped and tore at the already bruised and swollen soft tissues of the birth canal. Following the head, this articulated torso and limbs were extracted, piece by piece, a grim and methodical evacuation of the uterine cavity. The procedure was complete only when the physician, after a final, sweeping exploration with his hand, was satisfied that no significant parts of the fetus or the placenta remained. What was finally delivered onto the waiting cloths was not a child, but the fragmented remains of a dynastic hope, a collection of anatomical parts that bore little resemblance to a human infant. The moment the last piece was removed, a new and immediate crisis began. The body, which had been subjected to hours of extreme pressure and then sudden, followed with a torrent of blood. But the most significant damage was not the visible hemorrhage. It was the profound, multi-layered trauma inflicted upon the entire pelvic structure. The physician's work was done. He would step back, his hands and forearms slick with blood, while the midwife and her assistants rushed forward to manage the aftermath. Their immediate task was to stanch the bleeding, but they were working on a field of utter devastation. A clinical assessment of the damage would have revealed several layers of catastrophic injury. First were the lacerations. The passage of the sharp instruments and bone fragments would have caused deep, irregular tears. The cervix, the once muscular gate of the womb, would be grievously torn, a condition that in itself would have made future pregnancies nearly impossible. The walls of the vagina would be abraded and rectum. The perineum, the area between the vagina and the rectum, was likely torn through completely, creating a single, open wound known as a third or fourth degree laceration. Second was the blunt stroma. Every structure within the pelvic basin, the muscles, the ligaments, the connective tissues had been subjected to hours of crushing pressure, then the violent friction of the extraction. The entire area would be massively swollen and bruised, the tissues suffused with blood and lymphatic fluid. This internal damage, while not as immediately dramatic as the open wounds, was a significant source of pain and a fertile ground for the infection that was almost certain to follow. Third, and most devastating, was the invisible injury that had been occurring for hours before the surgeon's arrival. The unrelenting pressure of the impacted fetal head had compressed the soft tissues of the bladder and rectum against Margaret's own pelvic bone, cutting off their blood supply. This prolonged ischemia had resulted in tissue death, or necrosis. In the days to come, this dead tissue would slough away, leaving behind an unnatural opening or fistula between the bladder and the vagina, and potentially another between the rectum and the vagina. These were injuries for which there was no cure, permanent internal wounds that would have rendered Margaret incontinent for the rest of her life. The birth was over. The heir had been removed. The 13-year-old on the bed had, by the slimmest of margins, survived the mechanical ordeal, but she was left horrifically wounded, bleeding profusely from a dozen internal and external injuries. The room was now filled with the metallic scent of fresh blood, overlaying the older smell of putrefaction. The physician had won his brutal contest against the mechanical obstruction, but the true battle, the one against hemorrhage and the unseen armies of infection, had only just begun. In the immediate aftermath of the final brutal extraction, a moment of profound, stunned silence descended upon the chamber. The physician and the midwife, operating under the grim certainty of a fetal death, had prepared themselves for the removal of lifeless parts. What lay upon the blood-soaked cloths on the bed, however, was not what they expected. It was not a disarticulated corpse. It was a hole, shockingly small, and terror-beats, for a few heartbeats. The only sound was the ragged, shallow breathing of the mother and the dripping of blood onto the rushes. The assembled women, braced for a moment of grim closure, instead stared at an outcome that had, hours before, been deemed an impossibility. Then a flicker of movement, a weak, spastic jerk of a limb. Against all clinical expectation, the infant was alive. This single fact galvanized the room. The midwife, who had been preparing to manage the mother's hemorrhage, was momentarily frozen by the sight. She then lunged into action, her focus shifting with lightning speed from the mother to the child. Her first task was to assess its viability. The infant was not a healthy newborn. He was limp, his skin a dusky, bluish-gray color, the clinical sign of severe cyanosis from prolonged oxygen deprivation. His head was grotesquely misshapen, elongated and conical from the extreme molding it had undergone while being ground against his mother's pelvis. There were likely bruises and abrasions on his scalp from the pressure and potential contact with instruments. He was not crying, his breathing was a series of shallow, intermittent gasps. The midwife's hands were swift and practiced. Scooping the infant up, she would have held him upside down by the ankles, a standard procedure intended to drain fluid from the airway. She would have used a finger, wiped clean on her apron, to sweep out his mouth, clearing it of mucus and amniotic debris. She would have vigorously rubbed his back and chest with a rough cloth. The harsh friction, a desperate attempt to stimulate the respiratory centers of his brain. All attention was fixed on the small, blue form in her hands. Then, a sound, thin and dreary, a weak, gasping cry that was more a squeak of protest than a robust wail of life. It was, however, the sound of a breath being drawn. It was the sound of survival. Immediately, the infant was handed off to another attendant, likely the designated wet nurse, who wrapped him tightly in pre-warmed linen and carried him to the hearth, the warmest place in the room. His survival was now a matter of managing his body temperature and hoping his compromised lungs could continue their work. This was the arrival of Henry Tudor, the future King Henry VII. His entry into the world was not a triumphant moment, but a desperate, near-fatal struggle, a life salvaged from the very edge of oblivion. But the miracle of a living heir was instantly and violently counterbalanced by the state of his mother. As the attention of the chamber had focused on the infant for that critical minute, Margaret Beaufort continued to bleed. The physician's extraction had removed the obstruction, but the now empty uterus, exhausted and traumatized, had failed to contract. Without this powerful muscular clamping action, the large blood vessels at the placental site were left wide open, pumping blood freely into her body cavity. She was in the throes of a massive postpartum hemorrhage, the single greatest killer of women in childbirth. Her condition would have been visibly catastrophic. The pallor of her skin would be stark white, her lips and nail beds blue. She would be covered in a cold, clammy sweat. Her pulse, if the physician could find it, would be rapid and perilously weak. She was likely drifting in and out of consciousness, too weak from blood loss and shock to even register the cry of her son. The bed beneath her was a spreading pool of crimson. The dynastic objective had been achieved. A living male heir was born. But in that very moment of triumph, the matriarch from whom the entire line descended was actively dying. The focus of the room, once again, had to pivot with brutal speed from saving the infant to saving the mother. The brief, fragile moment of triumph surrounding the infant's survival was immediately consumed by a far more primal and immediate crisis: the mother's rapid exsanguination. The physician, turning from the sight of the living heir, was confronted with a scene of humoral catastrophe. The bed was no longer just stained, it was saturated, the crimson spreading in an ever-widening pool onto the floor rushes. This was not a controlled, postnatal blood flow, a hemorrhaging that signaled the body's complete failure to complete the final, critical stage of birth. From the physician's perspective, grounded in Galenic theory, this was a catastrophic loss of blood, the most vital of the four humors. It represented the escape of Margaret's innate heat and moisture, the very essence of her life force. The immediate objective was not simply to stop the bleeding, but to prevent the complete evacuation of her vital spirit. His actions, and those of the midwife who now worked at his direction, were a desperate, multi-pronged assault on this physiological breakdown. The first and most immediate intervention was external and mechanical. The midwife would have begun a vigorous, deep massage of Margaret's lower abdomen. This was an instinctive act, but one that contained a kernel of empirical truth. The goal was to manually stimulate the exhausted uterine muscle, to try and shock it back into a state of contraction. Simultaneously, attendants would have been ordered to bind Margaret's abdomen tightly with a long strip of linen, a birthing binder. The theory was that this external compression would help to close the womb and physically staunch the flow. While providing some counter-pressure, it was a woefully inadequate measure against the arterial pressure of the open vessels within. When these external efforts produced no discernible effect, the physician was forced to re-engage with the patient's body directly. This next step was a brutal and agonizing one. Having just subjected Margaret to a traumatic, invasive extraction, he now had to re-enter the very cavity he had just emptied. After rinsing his hands in a basin of wine or vinegar, an act of symbolic cleansing under practical application of an astringent, he would form his hand into a cone and insert it once again into the birth canal, past the grievously torn cervix, and up into the body of the uterus itself. Margaret, conscious but in a state of profound shock, would have endured an almost unimaginable wave of fresh pain. The purpose of this manual invasion was twofold. First, the physician would sweep the uterine cavity with his fingers, searching for any retained fragments of the placenta or large blood clots. In their medical framework, such remnants were believed to be a physical obstruction preventing the womb from closing, a foreign body causing it to remain open and weeping. Second, the physical presence and movement of the physician's hand within the uterus was the most powerful mechanical stimulant available. He would essentially use his fist to try and massage the uterine muscle from the inside, a procedure of last resort to induce the life-saving contraction. If even this failed to produce a sustained contraction, the final and most dangerous technique would be employed: uter unpacking. The physician would call for long strips of clean linen. These would sometimes be soaked in an astringent solution called water, vinegar, or red wine were common choices believed to have a puckering effect on the bleeding tissues. Then, using his hand or a smooth instrument, he would begin to methodically untie the entire uterine cavity with these linen strips. The goal was to create an internal tamponade, a massive absorbent material that would apply direct pressure to the bleeding placental bed and, by simple volume, physically prevent more blood from escaping. This was a high-stakes gamble. The packing, if done effectively, could slow the hemorrhage enough to allow the body's own clotting mechanisms to begin their work. Margaret's feet would be elevated, and cold cloths might be placed on her abdomen and between her legs, all in a desperate attempt to drive what little blood remained back to her vital organs and constrict the vessels. For the moment, the torrent was reduced to a slow, steady use. The physician and midwife had, through a series of violent, invasive, and agonizing procedures, managed to contain the immediate crisis. Margaret Beaufort was still alive, her body packed with foreign material, her system depleted of blood, hovering in the liminal space between life and death. But in solving the problem of hemorrhage, they had unwittingly and unavoidably set the stage for a new silent and far more lethal enemy. The warm, dark, blood-soaked linen packed deep within her body was a perfect culture medium, an ideal breeding ground for the invisible agents of infection. The physician had won the battle against mechanics and hemorrhage, but in doing so he had exposed his patient to an enemy that was silent, invisible, and infinitely more patient. The linen packed deep within Margaret's body was a foreign object, soaked in blood and serum, creating a warm, anaerobic, and nutrient-rich environment. It was, in effect, a perfectly prepared culture medium, placed directly against the raw, open wound of the placental site and the multiple lacerations of the birth canal. The hands and instruments that had performed the life-saving procedures had also been the delivery vectors, introducing a host of microorganisms from the outside world into this ideal breeding ground. The shadow that now fell over the lying-in chamber was that of puerperal sepsis, the condition known for centuries simply undominously as childbed fever. This was the great, unidentified plague of maternity wards and birthing chambers until the late 19th century. Its etiology, the chain of cause and effect, was a complete mystery to the 15th century mind. What we now understand as a systemic bacterial invasion, typically by streptococcal or staphylococcal species, was interpreted through the lens of humoral pathology as a putrid fever. The prevailing theory was that a portion of the lochia, the normal postpartum discharge of blood, mucus, and uterine tissue had been retained within the womb. This retained fluid, deprived of the body's vital heat, had begun to corrupt and putrefy, generating a malignant vapor, a kind of internal miasma, that poisoned the mother's entire system. The foul smell that would soon emanate from the bed was not seen as a symptom of infection, but as the disease itself made manifest. The chain of contamination had been established from the very beginning of the ordeal. Every invasive act, performed with the best of intentions, had been a step in the inoculation process. The midwife aunt had introduced the native flora of her own skin. The surgeon's hands and instruments, though perhaps rinsed, were far from sterile and carried their own microbial load. The fragments of tissue and clots left behind, despite the surgeon's best efforts to clear the cavity, provided a perfect substrate for bacterial colonization. The final, decisive act had been the uterine packing. The linen itself, stored in the castle, was not sterile. In packing it tightly against the open blood vessels, the physician had essentially ensured the direct introduction of bacteria into Margaret's bloodstream. This was an itogratenic disaster of the highest order, a disease delivered by the healer himself. The clinical course of childbed fever was terrifyingly predictable, a script from which there was seldom any deviation. For a day, perhaps two, a deceptive calm might settle. Margaret, though profoundly weakened and immense pain, might appear to be stabilizing. The immediate crisis of bleeding was past, but then the onset would be sudden and violent. It would begin not with a fever, but with a chill. A violent rigor would seize her body, her teeth chattering uncontrollably as she was racked by uncontrollable shivering, a physiological response to the flood of bacteria and their toxins into her bloodstream. This was followed by a precipitous rise in body temperature. The skin, once cold and clammy from shock, would become hot and flushed. The fever was relentless, and with it came a cascade of other symptoms. Her abdomen, already bruised and tender, would become distended and exquisitely painful to the slightest touch. The infection, having started in the uterus, endometritis, was now spreading to the lining of the abdominal cavity, causing peritonitis. Her pulse would become rapid and weak, a condition they would call the thread-Y pulse. The lochia, the postpartum discharge, would change character. Its normal, reddish flow would cease, replaced by a scant brownish and horrifically foul-smelling fluid, a clinical sign that confirmed, in the physician's mind, the theory of internal putrefaction. As the sepsis progressed, her mental state would alter. The high fever and systemic toxicity would lead to delirium. She might become restless, agitated, or lapse into a state of stupor. Her body, already depleted by the ordeal of labor and hemorrhage, had no reserves left to fight this new, overwhelming assault. The physician and midwife were now helpless spectators. Their treatments for such a fever, bloodletting to remove the corrupt humors, purgative S to cleanse the bowels, would only hasten the end by further dehydrating and weakening her. They had saved her from the unyielding mechanics of her own body, only to deliver her into the hands of an enemy whose existence they could not even imagine. They were watching a fire burn, and their every attempt to quench it was merely adding fuel. The ritual of the lying in was absolute. Its rules did not bend for medical catastrophe. Margaret Beaufort, now in the grip of a raging systemic infection, was not moved to a brighter, more airy room. Instead, the very environment designed to protect her now became an incubator for her illness. The sealed chamber, intended to ward off external miasmas, now wrapped the internal one. The warmth from the hearth, meant to support her vital heat, now amplified her fever. The darkness, intended to be calming, became a canvas for delirium. The sacred space of birth had transitioned seamlessly into a fever ward, and the period of convalescence was, in reality, a protracted death watch. The physician, confronted with the classic signs of a putrid fever, did not stand idly by. He deployed the full, aggressive arsenal of humoral medicine, a therapeutic strategy that, to a modern understanding, was almost perfectly designed to accelerate the patient's demise. The central diagnosis was a corruption of the blood, an excess of malignant humors generated by the putrefying matter within the womb, was to remove the corrupted fluid from the body by any available means. The first and most immediate treatment would have been phlebotomy or bloodletting. An attendant would have brought a small, sharp knife called a lancet and a brass or pewter bleeding bowl. The physician would select a vein, typically in the crook of Margaret's arm, and make a swift incision. The dark, feverish blood that flowed out was seen as the physical manifestation of the disease. The goal was to drain off this poison until the patient showed signs of fainting, a state interpreted as the successful evacuation of the humoral excess. For Margaret, already severely anemic from a massive postpartum hemorrhage, This procedure was a catastrophic assault on her body's remaining oxygen-carrying capacity. Each bowl of blood removed was a step closer to circulatory collapse. The second line of attack was purgation. The body, it was believed, needed to be cleansed from within. Powerful purgative endemetics, derived from plants like chamomile or hellebore, would have been mixed into a draught and forced between her lips. These substances were violent irritants to the gastrointestinal tract, inducing hours of severe vomiting and diarrhea. The physician would have examined the foul-smelling effluent, seeing in it the successful expulsion of the corrupt bile and phlegm that were feeding the fever. In reality, this was causing profound dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, further taxing her already failing kidneys and heart. Her body, desperate for fluid to fight the fever and infection, was being systematically emptied of it. Throughout this ordeal, Margaret would have been drifting in a state of febrile delirium. The line between the waking world and nightmare would have dissolved. The ornate tapestries on the walls, with their woven figures of saints and knights, might have seemed to move in the flickering candlelight, their faces twisting into menacing leers. The hushed Latin prayers of the priest and the whispered anxieties of her attendants would have merged into a disorienting, accusatory murmur. She was a prisoner in her own mind, tormented by fragmented visions and sounds, her consciousness untethered from reality. Her physical suffering was absolute. The peritonites in her abdomen would have caused a constant, agonizing pain exacerbated by the violent spasms of the induced vomiting in the physician's repeated examinations. A raging, unquenchable thirst, a hallmark of severe fever and dehydration, would have been a central feature of her torment. Yet, her diet would have been restricted to fever foods, thin, watery gruel and less than barley water, as solid food was believed to add to the body's humoral burden. The women of the chamber, led by her mother, were now no longer ceremonial attendants but nurses in a desperate, round-the-clock struggle. Their tasks were grim, holding Margaret down during the bloodletting, managing the basins of vomit and excreta, constantly changing the sweat and blood-soaked linens, and using cool, damp cloths to try and provide some small comfort from the searing heat of the fever. They were tending to a body that was being systematically dismantled, both by the disease and by its purported cure. The chamber, once filled with the scent of herbs and incense, now reeked of sickness, blood, and the acrid smell of the purgative s. For days, Margaret Beaufort would have existed in this state, a barely living entity at the center of a vortex of pain, delirium, and misguided medical intervention, trapped in the suffocating darkness of her prescribed convalescence. Against all medical logic and expectation, the fever eventually broke. The crisis, which had raged for days, receded, leaving Margaret Beaufort washed out, skeletal, and impossibly alive. Her survival was not a recovery in any modern sense. It was an emergence from a battlefield, a cessation of hostilities that left the terrain of her body permanently scarred and fundamentally altered. The ordeal of birth and the subsequent infection had inscribed upon her anatomy the injuries, some visible, some hidden, but all of which would define the physical reality of her existence for the rest of her life. The most devastating of these injuries were the direct result of the prolonged, obstructed labor. The hours of unrelenting pressure from the impacted fetal head had, as described, crushed the soft tissues of her bladder and rectum against her own pelvic bone. The ischemic tissue, starved of blood, had died. In the days following the fever's break, this necrotic tissue would have sloughed away, creating unnatural passages or fistulas. The most likely of these was a vesicovaginal fistula, a direct, open channel between her bladder and her vagina. The immediate and horrifying consequence of this was total urinary incontinence. She would have had no control, not even a sensation of the need to void. There would have been a constant, unstoppable seepage of urine, soaking her linens and clothing, a condition that was both physically and socially catastrophic. The constant dampness would have led to painful excoriation of the skin on her thighs and perineum. An ever-present, acrid odor of ammonia would have clung to her, a smell that no amount of washing or perfume could fully mask. In an era where bodily integrity was closely linked to spiritual purity, this condition would have been a source of profound shame and humiliation. It would have made the normal intimacies of married life difficult, if not impossible, and required a lifetime of meticulous, hidden management with pads of moss or linen. It is also possible she sustained a recto-vaginal fistula, an opening between the rectum and vagina, which would have resulted in the uncontrolled passage of gas and feces, compounding the physical misery and social isolation. These were injuries for which the 15th century had no name and no cure. Beyond this, the structural integrity of her entire pelvic basin was compromised. The violent, forcible extraction of the infant would have torn the muscles and ligaments of the pelvic floor, the supportive sling that holds the internal organs in place. In the years that followed, this would have almost certainly led to pelvic organ prolapse. Her bladder, a sister cell, and rectum or rectusole would have begun to bulge into the vaginal canal, creating a constant sensation of heaviness, pressure, and of her internal organs falling out. The uterus itself, torn from its moorings, could have descended, a condition known as uterine prolapse. This chronic structural failure would have been a source of constant discomfort, back pain, and a persistent sense of physical brokenness. Finally, the puerperal fever, the massive pelvic infection she had so narrowly survived, left its own deep and invisible scars. A modern diagnosis would identify this as a severe case of pelvic inflammatory disease. The bacteria would not have confined themselves to the uterus. They would have spread throughout the pelvic cavity, infecting the fallopian tubes, salpingitis, and the ovaries. The body's response to such a widespread infection is to create scar tissue, or adhesions. Fibrous tissue would have formed, binding her internal organs together in an unnatural, immobile mass. The delicate feathery ends of her fallopian tubes, essential for capturing an egg from the ovary, would have become blocked and sealed shut. The uterus, its inner lining savaged by infection and the surgeon's packing, would have been scarred and damaged. The cumulative effect of this internal devastation was secondary infertility. The physical passages for a future conception were sealed. Her body, having endured one pregnancy at an impossible cost, was now biologically incapable of another. Though she would marry twice more into politic and powerful families, Margaret Beaufort would never again conceive a child. This was not a choice, but a physiological sentence passed upon her at the age of 13. Her survival was a testament to an extraordinary constitutional resilience. But the price of that survival was the permanent wreckage of her reproductive and urinary systems. She was left with a body that would cause her chronic pain, subject her to constant incontinence, and deny her the primary dynastic function of a noblewoman. The physical record of her ordeal was written into her very anatomy, a secret testament of suffering she would carry for the remaining 53 years of her life. The physical architecture of her body was not the only structure to be permanently altered by the events of 1457th, the psychological imprint of the ordeal, though unrecorded in any chronicle, can be inferred from the subsequent trajectory of her life and the development of her famously formidable character. The experience of the lying-in chamber was a trauma of a totalizing nature, combining extreme physical pain, the imminent threat of death, a profound loss of control, and a violent violation of her physical being. Such an event does not merely leave scars, it fundamentally reconstructs the survivor's relationship with the world, with their body, and with their own sense of agency. At its core, the ordeal represented a complete and protracted annihilation of personal autonomy. From the moment she was sealed in the chamber, Margaret Beaufort was an object, a vessel whose own will and experience were subordinate to the dynastic, theological, and medical imperatives of others. During the final, surgical phase, her body was transformed from a sovereign entity into a passive field upon which a brutal mechanical procedure was enacted. She was held down, invaded, and mutilated, all without her consent and without any means of escape or resistance. A logical psychological sequel to such a profound experience of powerlessness as an intensified, lifelong pursuit of control in all other domains of existence. Her subsequent history is a testament to this compensatory drive. Margaret Beaufort evolved into one of the most astute political operators and administrators of her era, meticulously managing her vast estates, forging and breaking alliances with ruthless pragmatism, and maintaining an iron grip on her own household and finances. This relentless pursuit of power and influence can be interpreted not merely as ambition, but as a deeply ingrained, post-traumatic strategy to ensure she would never again be placed in a position of such absolute helplessness. The dominant interpretive framework available to a 15th century mind for processing such suffering was theological. As discussed, the pain of childbirth was understood as a divine penance. By this logic, to survive an ordeal that killed so many others was not a matter of luck, but a sign of divine providence. Margaret's survival, against all odds, could be reframed as a testament to her spiritual fortitude and a mark of God's favor. This provided a powerful narrative structure through which to make sense of the meaningless chaos of her suffering. Her subsequent, famously intense piety, her strict adherence to daily masses, her patronage of religious houses, her eventual vow of celibacy even while married can be seen as more than conventional devotion. It was an active and continuous engagement with the only system of thought that could imbue her trauma with meaning. The ordeal was thus transmuted from a biological catastrophe into a crucible, a purifying fire that had tested her soul and found it worthy. Her body was broken, but her spiritual purpose, in her own eyes, had been forged and clarified in the process. Finally, the biological finality of her injuries, her inability to bear more children, had a profound and concentrating effect on her psychological and strategic focus. For an aristocratic woman of her time, dynastic continuation through multiple heirs was a primary function. This path was irrevocably closed to her. The result was that all of her formidable energy, her intellect, and her dynastic ambition were channeled, with a singular, unwavering intensity, into the one living child her ordeal had produced. Henry ceased to be merely her son. He became the sole vessel of her ambition, her only legacy, and the ultimate justification for the suffering she had endured. Her decades-long, clandestine campaign to place him on the throne, a campaign she waged through multiple marriages and the treacherous political landscape of the Wars of the Roses, was the defining project of her life. It was the strategic redirection of a fundamental biological and social imperative. The trauma did not destroy her ambition, it stripped it of all other possible targets, focusing it with the intensity of a lens onto a single, distant, and seemingly impossible objective: the English crown. Her resilience was not a passive quality, it was an active, strategic adaptation to the permanent limitations her trauma had imposed. While the mother's body was a landscape of devastation and her psyche a crucible of trauma, the infant who had been the cause of it all was instantly, unseamlessly recontextualized. In the seconds following his first weak cry, Henry Tudor ceased to be a biological entity, a fragile newborn at the edge of viability. He became an object of immense and immediate political significance. His survival, precarious as it was, transformed him into the living embodiment of Lancastrian and Beaufort claims, a dynastic asset of the highest order. The focus of the household, which had for days been consumed by the drama of the birth, now pivoted with pragmatic speed to the preservation of this new, invaluable commodity. His physical state was a secondary concern to his symbolic status. Though he had endured a prolonged and traumatic birth, marked by severe oxygen deprivation, his mere existence was a political victory. He was a male heir. He was the posthumous son of Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. He was the great-great-grandson of King Edward II through legitimized, if contested, line. In a kingdom teetering on the brink of civil war, where the legitimacy and mental fitness of the reigning Lancastrian king, Henry V, ein Austrian king, were in constant question, this infant represented a potent new piece on the political chessboard. His uncle, Jasper Tudor, the staunch Lancastrian who had overseen the confinement at Pembroke Castle, would have recognized this immediately. The infant was not his nephew, he was the future of the course. The first order of business was the infant's immediate care, which was itself a political act. The wet nurse who had been chosen with care months before would have taken complete charge. Her role was paramount. In the medical understanding of the day, a nurse did not merely provide nourishment. She transmitted her own humoral qualities and moral character through her milk. Therefore, her health, diet, and disposition were of the utmost importance and would be subject to strict supervision. The infant Henry would have been separated from his mother almost immediately. Margaret, in her fevered and broken state, was considered a source of morbid humors and dangerous effluvia, an environment of sickness from which the precious heir had to be protected. This separation, while medically logical within their framework, established a pattern of distance between mother and son that would, by necessity and circumstance, continue for much of their lives. The next critical step was the sacrament of baptism. This was not merely a religious rite, but a planned legal necessity, a public act that formally established the child's identity, legitimacy, and place within the Christian community and the aristocratic hierarchy. It would have been arranged with the greatest possible speed, likely within a day or two of the birth. The ceremony would have taken place in the castle chapel at Pembroke, attended by Jasper Tudor and other key members of the household who would act as godparents. The selection of godparents was itself a strategic decision, forging new bonds of kinship and obligation. By this single act, the infant was given a name, a lineage, and a soul recognized by the church, securing his legal status as his father's heir and inoculating him against any future challenges to his legitimacy. From that moment on, the infant Henry's life was no longer his own. His upbringing, his education, his eventual marriage, all would be dictated by the shifting tides of the dynastic struggle. He was now a symbol, a rallying point for the Lancastrian faction. His very existence was a threat to the rival House of York. For the next 14 years, he would live as a ward, and at times a virtual prisoner of Yorkist lords, his life a constant bargaining chip in the ongoing conflict. He was raised not by his mother, whom he would see only rarely, but by his captors and guardians, men who understood his value and the latent power contained within his person. The physical and emotional bond between mother and son, forged immediately severed by the cold, pragmatic demands of politics. The suffering had been private and corporeal, but the product of that suffering was now entirely public property, an icon of a cause whose fate was far from certain. The infant, salvaged from the brink of death, was now a political object, his human needs subordinate to his dynastic function. The survival of both Margaret Beaufort and her infant son, Henry Tudor, must be understood not as a triumph of medical skill, but as a profound statistical anomaly. It was an event that defied the accumulated demographic realities of the 15th century at nearly every stage. To contextualize the sheer improbability of this double survival, one must examine the multiple overlapping layers of lethality they faced and successfully, if not cleanly, navigated. Each layer represented a high probability of failure, and their passage through all of them constitutes an outcome of extraordinary rarity. The first and most fundamental layer of risk was maternal mortality in general. Death in childbirth was a constant and accepted feature of the demographic landscape. While precise statistics for the era are impossible to calculate, historical demographers estimate that the maternal mortality rate was staggeringly high, perhaps as many as 15 to 25 deaths per 1,000 live births. A woman who bore multiple children had a significant lifetime risk of dying in the process. The primary killers were postpartum hemorrhage, puerperal infection, and obstructed labor. Margaret Beaufort did not face one of these. She faced all three in their most acute forms. She experienced a textbook case of obstructed labor, followed by a destructive surgical intervention, a massive postpartum hemorrhage, and a life-threatening systemic infection. To survive even one of these complications was fortunate. To survive the complete, sequential cascade was an event that bordered on the statistically miraculous. Compounding this was the second layer: Margaret's extreme youth and physical immaturity. She was a premigravida, a woman giving birth for the first time, which in itself carried a higher risk of complications. More critically, she was 13. Her pelvic girdle was not fully developed, making the mechanical disproportion between her body and the fetal head almost a certainty. This factor alone dramatically increased the likelihood of the primary complication, obstructed labor. Her own body was still in a state of growth, placing an additional metabolic and physiological strain on her system, reducing her reserves of endurance and her ability to withstand the subsequent hemorrhage and infection. Childbirth for a physically mature woman was perilous. For a child, it was an event that pushed the body far beyond its designed limit. The third layer of risk was the nature of the intervention itself. The shift from a natural birth managed by a midwife to an instrumental delivery performed by a surgeon represented a quantum leap in the probability of a fatal outcome. Procedures like craniotypy and embryotomy, even when successful in their immediate goal of extraction, carried an astronomically high mortality rate for the mother. They were acts of controlled violence performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or an understanding of anatomy that could prevent catastrophic internal injury. The risk of perforating the uterus, bladder, or bowel was immense. The introduction of unsterilized instruments and hands deep into the body cavity made a subsequent, lethal infection not a risk, but a near certainty. For a mother to survive such a procedure was an exceptional outcome. Fourth, one must consider the probability of the infant's survival. Neonatal mortality in the 15th century was exceptionally high. It is estimated that a quarter to a third of all infants did not survive their first year. Henry Tudor's starting conditions placed him at the extreme end of this risk spectrum. He was the product of a prolonged, traumatic, obstructed labor, a process that subjected him to hours of severe fetal distress and progressive asphyxia. Infants who survive such an ordeal are often born in a state of shock, with compromised respiratory and neurological function. Furthermore, he was born to a mother who was herself in a state of physiological collapse and was almost immediately plunged into a life-threatening fever, rendering her incapable of providing care and making her milk, in their view, a potential source of poison. That he survived the immediate postnatal period with its high risks of respiratory failure and the subsequent week, with their risks of starvation and infection, was a parallel improbability. The final and most remarkable aspect is the combined survival. The typical outcome of a scenario like Margaret Beaufort's was the death of both mother and child during labor, or the death of the infant during the extraction and the mother from infection days later. The survival of one would have been noteworthy. The survival of both the child mother and the severely distressed infant, through an obstructed labor, a disruptive surgery, the massive hemorrhage, and a raging septic feverage, a massive hemorrhage, represents a convergence of improbable outcomes. This statistical outlier, this double survival against overwhelming odds, was not merely a private footnote in the annals of medical misfortune. It was the improbable biological event upon which the future of a kingdom would pivot. The double survival was, in the cold calculus of probability, an event that should not have happened. Yet, it did. This statistical deviation, born of a 13-year-old's improbable resilience and a newborn's tenacious hold on life, was not merely a personal miracle. It was the seed of a new historical epoch. The private, unrecorded agony that transpired within the walls of Pembroke Castle did not end when the bleeding stopped. It radiated outward, shaping the political landscape of England for the next century. The Tudor dynasty was not simply founded by Henry Tudor, it was founded by the specific, brutal circumstances of his birth, a dynasty forged in undefined by the trauma of its own creation. The most profound and direct consequence was biological. The catastrophic injuries Margaret Beaufort sustained rendered her sterile. For any other noblewoman, this would have been a personal tragedy and a dynastic failure. For the nascent Tudor line, it was, paradoxically, its greatest strategic asset. Margaret's inability to have more children meant that Henry Tudor was, and would always be, her sole heir. He had no brothers to challenge his claim, no rivals for his mother's immense inheritance and influence. The Wars of the Roses had been a conflict fueled by a surplus of Plantagenet males with competing, legitimate claims. The Tudor dynasty, which would ultimately end that conflict, principled the absolute singularity of its claimant. This biological finality concentrated all of Margaret's formidable resources, her wealth, her intelligence, her political connections onto a single point. There was only Henry. This concentration of purpose was the psychological engine of the Tudor ascent. As established, Margaret's life became a singular project, the elevation of the son, who was the living justification for her suffering. She navigated to more politically astute marriages, to Henry Stafford and then to Thomas Stanley, using her position and wealth to quietly build a network of support for her exiled son. Her clandestine negotiations with Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of the York i.e. King Edward IV, to arrange the marriage between Henry and Elizabeth of York, was a masterstroke of political alchemy. It was this proposed union that transformed Henry from a minor Lancastrian claimant into a consensus candidate, a figure who could unite the warring houses. This was not the work of a distant, doting mother, it was the calculated, relentless maneuvering of a survivor who had sublimated her personal trauma into an unbreakable political will. The ordeal also shaped the character of the heir himself. Henry Tudor's life began at the absolute nadir of his family's fortunes, a near-death experience that immediately gave way to a youth spent in exile, under the constant threat of assassination. He was not raised with the arrogant certainty of a prince born in a palace. He was raised with the cautious pragmatism of a fugitive. When he finally seized the throne at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, he did not rule like his planted predecessors. He was not a warrior king who gloried in battle, but a meticulous, almost obsessive administrator. He was famously parsimonious, rebuilding the crown's shattered dynasty, using marriage treaties to secure his dynasty rather than armies to expand his territory. His entire reign was a calculated effort to create stability, to extinguish rival claims, and to ensure that his own children would never have to endure the precarity that had defined his own life. This obsession with security and legitimacy, the defining feature of his rule, was a direct psychological consequence of an existence that had begun in utter powerlessness. The entire Tudor state, with its powerful central bureaucracy and its ruthless suppression of dissent, was built on the foundations of its founders' deep-seated insecurity, an insecurity born in that dark, sealed chamber. The agony of the mother became the political DNA of the son, and through him, the defining characteristic of the dynasty he created. The account is now complete. But before the record is sealed, it is worth pausing to consider the mechanism we have just witnessed. The grand narrative of history, as it is often told, is a story of battles of laws of great speeches and decisive treaties. It is a chronicle of conscious human agency, of powerful men making calculated choices that alter the fate of nations. What the ordeal of Margaret Beaufort reveals, however, is a different kind of history, one that operates at a microscopic, biological level. It is a history whose course is dictated not by the will of a king, but by the diameter of a child's pelvis. Its turning points are marked not by the clash of armies, but by the introduction of bacteria into a wound. Its outcomes are determined not by political strategy, but by the body's finite capacity to withstand hemorrhage and shock. The survival of a dynasty, in this instance, hinged upon the random resilience of a single woman's constitution, a statistical anomaly that falls outside the realm of political analysis. This reminds us that beneath the official chronicles, there is always a second, unwritten history, a history of the human body. It is a story of pain, of sickness, of physical limitation, and of the brute, biological facts of existence. The ambition of a dynasty is meaningless without a body capable of producing an heir. The legitimacy of a king is irrelevant if his body fails him. In the end, the great structures of power and politics are all built upon the fragile, vulnerable, and often agonized foundation of human flesh. We have examined one such foundation laid in darkness and blood. It is a reminder that the most profound historical forces are often silent, internal, and leave no visible trace in the archives, save for the consequences that ripple out from them, and so we leave them to their fate. But ask yourself how thin really is the line between civilization and the savagery we just witnessed. Goodbye. The end of the article.